Once we've done a threat assessment, then it's time to do a vulnerability appraisal, where we look at all those different threats and we try to assess our vulnerability to those threats. So it's determining current weaknesses as a snapshot of the current organization's security. Every asset is viewed in light of a threat. So we use that threat analysis that we've done before, the threat modeling or some kind of threat analysis. Again, it could have been the looking at the different keywords or the different categories and coming up with what the threats could be. Or we can get more specific by looking at the attack tree or a combination of both. But once we understand what those threats are, now we're going to catalog these different vulnerabilities and do a risk assessment to determine the damage resulting from the various attacks that we've identified, the likelihood that the vulnerability is a risk to our organization. Not all risks are likely, so there are many things that we may come up with in an attack tree that would be very unlikely. For example, when I talked about the car stereo being stolen, that's actually not a very common attack. Most of us, knock on wood, will not experience a carjacking. So it's not something that most of us protect against actively. We just kind of hope that it doesn't happen to us, and for the most part, it doesn't. Other things, however, do happen much more frequently. So a risk assessment, which we've talked about in this course before, is determining the damage resulting from an attack and assess the likelihood that the vulnerability is a risk to the organization. So determining damage from an attack requires a realistic look at the several different types of attacks that might occur. So based on the vulnerabilities that we recognize in the vulnerability appraisal, a risk assessment of the impact can then be undertaken. So let's take a look at this. So here's our vulnerability impact scale. So the impact ranges from no impact to catastrophic. And again, this goes to an objective method of trying to categorize these threats. So what we're trying to do is categorize the risk of these threats. In other words, if that threat comes to fruition, is it going to be a catastrophic effect, or is it going to have very little or no impact, or somewhere in between? And again, it's all about trying to come up with some objective scale that we can use to measure these different threats that we've identified. Once we've identified these different threats and these risks, and we've evaluated them, then we decide whether or not we want to mitigate them and how. So it's determining what to do about the risks that we've identified. Risk can never be entirely eliminated. It would cost too much to entirely eliminate a risk. There are lots of things that you could do to entirely eliminate the risk of a fire in your home, but most of us aren't willing to spend the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of implementing some kind of fire prevention system that's going to be foolproof. It just isn't worth it. So some risks must be accepted, and by default, the degree of risk must always be assumed. The question is not how can we eliminate all risk, but how much acceptable risk can we tolerate? And if you can't tolerate the risk, you find some way to mitigate it until that mitigation factor outweighs what the cost of the risk. For example, I could spend $150,000 to outfit my home with some fire prevention equipment that would be completely foolproof, but the value of my home is scarcely worth that much. And I also have insurance that I use to transfer that risk. So once the toleration level is known, steps can be taken to mitigate the risk based on that tolerance level. So these are the steps that we've talked about: asset identification, threat identification, the vulnerability appraisal, a risk assessment, and then finally risk mitigation. And we've talked about these. So we've talked about many of these topics in more detail in other units and courses. Of course, IT Security 1 covered risk assessment in much more detail, as well as how to mitigate risks and some of the things that we can do about risk. But here we've talked about, number one, we have to identify what these assets are. Then we have to brainstorm what these threats are going to be using some kind of modeling technique or brainstorming technique, and then a vulnerability appraisal to determine all of these weaknesses and the likelihood that they're going to happen, and what they're and then we assess what the risk is. How is this going to happen? Could it happen? Are we going to accept that risk? And then finally, what to do about it. All right, so baseline reporting is an imaginary line by which an element is measured or compared and can be seen as a standard. So IT baseline is a checklist against which systems can be evaluated and audited for security postures. I'll put this kind of in English here. Basically, baselining is when we take what we know is a secure implementation that we've already decided. I'll give you an example. Let's say Microsoft Windows. We all have that splattered all over our networks. Love it or hate it, Windows is everywhere, whether the workstation or server, for example. Not so much the phones, though. So if we know that there's a certain level of security that we need on every Windows workstation, and we develop some sort of standard for that base level of security, that's our baseline. And our baseline allows us to check our deviations from that baseline. So if I know that a secure distribution of Windows for my environment looks like X, and I start to find things that look like Y, I can compare that deviation, and I know that I'm deviating from my baseline. So it's kind of knowing, first what your standards are, and then having some way to measure against those standards. So that's what baseline reporting is, and your textbook has a section where they discuss that.